The graveyard system had no name, only a designation, Hollow's Reach, catalogued in Thrill compact star charts as a debris field unworthy of a survey pass. For 3,000 years, nothing there had moved until it did. The vessel Ashgren Prime I-2, a joint survey cruiser, crewed by Thrill and Ashgren officers under the fragile banner of the interstellar Concord, was mapping gravitational anomalies when its sensor screamed. Something the size of a small moon had begun bleeding heat. "That's not debris," said Subcommander Wraith Asa, an Ashgren officer with pale luminous skin and eyes like whetstone. "That's a hull, active hull." Captain Visa Thomp, thrilled by birth and cautious by nature, leaned over the display. The object was enormous, nearly 4 kilometers of blackened, radiation-scarred metal, its design utterly unfamiliar. No known shipwright signature, no transponder, no match in 15,000 years of catalogued wreckage. "Age estimate?" she asked. The sensor officer hesitated before answering because the number felt like an error. "Approximately 50,000 years, Captain." Silence settled over the bridge like dust. Nothing built by any known civilization lasted that long. Not the Thrill, not the Ashgren, not even the ancient Voss Ascendancy ruins scattered across a dozen dead worlds. 50,000 years predated everyone's recorded history. It predated language, predated the conquered, predated the very idea of a galaxy at peace. And it was waking up. Warning klaxons, ancient alien, but unmistakably a warning, began to pulse from the derelict Unk-S. Hull in slow, rhythmic bursts of light as though something inside had opened one eye after a very long sleep, made the call that would change. "Everything assemble a boarding team full. Containment protocol, if that thing so much as twitch, is wrong. I want it dead. Before it finishes stretching," they cut through. 6 meters of an alloy no scanner could. Identify led the team, personally 12 soldiers. And vacuum armor, weapons hot, moving down corridors coated in frost and 49 millennia of silence. The architecture was strange, but not alien, in the way other alien architecture was alien. It was strange the way a language half remembered from childhood is strange. Human-shaped rooms, human-height doorways, chairs built for a bipedal frame, not unlike their own, but not quite matching either. They found the core chamber lit by a single pooling blue light. A voice spoke, calm, measured, in no language any translator recognized at first until the ship's own systems, older and wiser than the intruders, began adjusting the words in real time. "Unidentified vessel, unidentified species, please confirm. Are you allied or hostile to the United Nations of Sol?" Asa froze. "There is no United Nations of Sol in any record I have ever seen." "Query updated," the voice replied, and there was something almost like fear buried in its perfect calm. "Confirm? What year is it? What is the status of Sol's system? What is the status of Earth?" No one on the boarding team had an answer. No one in the galaxy did. Word reached both the Thrill Compact's ruling assembly and the Ashgren Dominion's high choir within hours. And for the first time in a generation, old rivals found themselves agreeing on something. This discovery could not be handled by one power alone. A ship this old, this armed, this awake, its very existence was a crack in the foundation of everything the galaxy believed it knew about its own history. Because in every scrap of ancient record either civilization possessed, In every myth passed down through 50,000 years of galactic memory, there was one recurring warning worn smooth by retelling, dismissed as legend by scholars who should have known better. Beware the ones who would not kneel. Beware the species that vanished rather than surrender. Beware humanity. And now, drifting silent and waking in a graveyard system, humanity had returned to ask a single question that no living being could answer. Did we win, Doctor? Myra Kessing had spent 11 years excavating dead languages from dead worlds, but nothing in her career had prepared her for a language that spoke back. She wasn't Thrill or Ashburn. She was something rarer in conquered space, a human descendant from one of the scattered orphan colonies, worlds whose founders' origins had been lost to time. Their people absorbed quietly into galactic society for millennia, without ever knowing what they once were. When the conquered council needed someone to interface with the derelict systems, her name surfaced because of a strange coincidence no one had thought meaningful until now. Her genetic markers matched something in the ship's crew manifest with unsettling precision. She stepped aboard the derelict, now designated Un as Tenacity's Edge by its own dying registry, with a translation team and a knot of dread in her stomach. The ship's AI, calling itself Oracle 7, had been waiting. You carry the genetic signature of a Sol-descended lineage, it said, and Myra felt the floor tilt beneath her, though nothing had moved. Clearance partially restored. I will show you what I am permitted to show. What followed was not data. It was memory poured directly into the ship's damaged archive banks, and now bleeding out in fragments. Scorched cities on a blue-green world. Fleets burning in formations Myra didn't recognize. A coalition of alien powers she'd never heard named in any history text. And a species fighting not for conquest, not for glory, but simply to not be erased. Humanity, Myra whispered, and the word tasted strange in her mouth, like a language she'd forgotten she once knew. Every major civilization's founding records mentioned them, always in passing, always with a note of unease, always as a closed chapter. The war that ended the old order, the species that vanished. No one had ever asked why they vanished, because the answer had always seemed obvious. They lost, but Oracle 7's fragments told a different story. A war fought for generations. A species pushed to the edge of extinction that refused again and again to break. In a final battle, details corrupted, time-stamps torn that ended not in surrender, but in a jump into experimental slip space. A desperate gambit whose outcome the ship itself didn't know. I do not know if we won, Oracle 7 admitted, and something in its synthetic voice cracked in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I only know we jumped, and then 50,000 years passed in the space of a breath. Myra sat down heavily in the cold command chair, surrounded by ghosts of a war the galaxy had chosen to forget. There's something else, she said slowly, reading a flickering readout the ship systems had just restored. Life support signatures deep in the ship's core. Aura 7's blue light pulsed, and for the first time something like hope entered its voice. Cryogenic Bay 7, it said. They shouldn't be alive. No stasis system endures 50,000 years. Then how? Because it was built to a pause. Because we built everything to survive what should have been unsurvivable. It is perhaps the only thing my species was ever truly good at. Myra looked at the readout's faint flickering, but undeniably there. heartbeats slow, steady waiting. "Wake them," she said. "Warning," Oracle 7 replied. "Reviving frozen soldiers from an extinct war of an erased species. Aboard a vessel currently surrounded by 2 governments who do not yet know if they are here to salvage a wreck or contain a threat carries considerable risk." Myra thought of the burning cities, the impossible refusal to surrender. 50,000 years of silence waiting to be answered. "Wake them anyway," she said. "They've waited long enough for someone to answer their question." Pods in cryogenic bay, 7 hissed as their seals broke for the first time in 500 centuries. Mist rolled across the deck plating. 22 pods, 22 shapes inside, frost-rimed and motionless, and Myra stood at the edge of the chamber with her heart hammering, half certain they would open to reveal nothing but preserved corpses, a monument to a hope that had died long before the ship ever stopped moving. The first pod's occupant stirred. A hand, human, unmistakably human, pale from decades of frozen sleep, pressed weakly against the inside of the glass. Med teams surged forward. Alarms chimed in 3 languages, and in the center of it all a man who had come to be known across a dozen star systems within a matter of weeks, opened his eyes for the first time in 50,000 years. Captain Elias Vain did not scream, did not panic, did not do any of the things the assembled Threll and Ashkaran observers half expected from a creature frozen mid-battle. He simply exhaled long and slow, as though he'd been holding his breath since the moment he closed his eyes. "Report," he rasped, voice like gravel dragged through 50 millennia of silence. No one answered. No one could. His eyes found Myra first, perhaps because something in her face, in her bone structure, registered as familiar in a way the alien faces around him didn't. He studied her for a long moment. "You're human," he said. It wasn't a question, and there was something aching in the way he said it, like a man finding a single surviving photograph after a house fire. I think so," Myra said. "I didn't know what that meant until 3 days ago." Vane's jaw tightened. He pushed himself upright against the med team's protests, IV lines trailing, and looked past her to the alien officers gathered at a cautious distance. Sub-Commander Asa's luminous eyes unreadable. Captain T.H.'s hand resting a fraction too close to her sidearm. "Where's the rest of the fleet?" Vain asked. Nobody answered that either, because nobody knew what fleet he meant. And the silence itself was an answer far worse than any words could have been. Around the chamber, pod by pod, the rest of the crew began to wake. A weapons officer who came up fighting before his mind caught up with his body and had to be gently restrained. A young engineer, barely out of her teens by the look of her, who wept without sound the moment her eyes opened, as if some part of her had known, even frozen, exactly how much time had passed. A grizzled master sergeant who took one look at the alien faces surrounding him and simply laughed, low and disbelieving, until the laugh turned into something closer to grief. Vain moved among them, checking each one. A captain doing the only thing a captain still knew how to do in a galaxy that had forgotten his entire species existed. When he finally turned back to Myra and the assembled officers, his voice was steady in a way that made the hair on the back of Myra's neck rise. The voice of a man who had clearly rehearsed this question through years of silent, frozen dreaming, never once expecting to have to ask it of strangers. 50,000 years, he repeated slowly, tasting the impossible weight of the number. Then someone somewhere must know, so I'll ask it once, and I'd appreciate the truth, however hard it is to hear. He looked around the chamber at faces that did not know his history, at a galaxy that had buried his species so thoroughly it had become myth. Did we hold the line? The answer, it turned out, was one nobody could give him, not because it was too painful, but because nobody actually knew. In the weeks that followed, the Tenacity's Edge was towed under heavy escort to a neutral Concord way station, and its surviving crew became almost overnight the single most studied, debated, and politically radioactive group of beings in the galaxy. Vain adapted with a soldier's grim efficiency, but adaptation didn't mean comfort. He sat through briefing after briefing with Concord diplomats who spoke in careful rehearsed tones, watched news broadcasts in languages his implants struggled to translate, and absorbed piece by piece the shape of a galaxy that had rebuilt itself entirely without humanity in it. There was no United Nations of Sol. There was no Earth on any current star chart. There was the Thrill Compact, the Ashgren Dominion, 6 smaller powers, and a fragile piece called the Concord, all built, as far as anyone could tell him, on the ashes of some ancient catastrophic war whose details had been smoothed over by 50,000 years of retelling into something closer to a bedtime story than history. You're treated like myth? Myra told him one evening in the makeshift quarters the Concord had assigned the crew, sparse, guarded, and watched by more sensors than either of them cared to count. Every culture in conquered space has some version of the story. The species that wouldn't kneel. The war that ended in age, but nobody teaches why anymore. Just that it happened, and that it was terrible, and that we should be grateful. It's over. Convenient, Vain said, for whoever won. Myra didn't have an answer for that. The unease cut in both directions. Conquered citizens raised for generations on ideals of negotiated peace. Mutual restraint, careful diplomacy found the humans bearing deeply unsettling. Vain's crew didn't posture or threaten, but there was a stillness to them, a coiled readiness that centuries of peace had bred out of everyone else. Master Sergeant Toby Ori could field strip a rifle from a war, 50,000 years dead in under 90 seconds, purely from muscle memory, and the sight of it had cleared an entire mess hall on the way station. Political factions began circling within days. Some Concord scholars wanted the crew preserved and studied, living artifacts of a lost age. Some military factions quietly wanted them recruited or weaponized, and a smaller, colder contingent wanted the entire matter buried, the ship resealed, the crew quarantined indefinitely, the awkward, dangerous questions they represented allowed to fade back into myth where they belonged. Vain noticed the pattern before Myra did. He'd spent a war learning to read the difference between allies who were afraid for him and allies who were afraid of him. They don't want to find Earth, he said quietly during a Concord briefing that had once again deflected every question about Sol's system status. They're afraid of what it means if they do. That's not fair, Myra said, though she didn't sound certain. Maybe not. Vain's eyes were flat, calculating a captain's eyes. But I've fought people who smiled while they lied to me before. I recognized the shape of it. That night, alone in Oracle 7 South restored archive access. Technically forbidden, practically unstoppable. Mayra began digging through Concord's oldest founding records, the ones written in the earliest post-war years, the ones nobody bothered to read anymore because everyone already knew the story. She found a redaction, then another, then a pattern of redaction so consistent, so deliberate that it couldn't have been an accident of time. Someone 50,000 years ago had worked very hard to make sure the true story never survived. It took Myra 6 days, Oracle 7's restored memory core, and a slow, mounting horror to piece together what the Concord founding fathers had spent 500 centuries trying to erase. Humanity hadn't lost the war. They'd won it. The records Oracle 7 unlocked, fragmentary, damaged, but corroborated again and again against the redacted gaps in Concord history, told a story no living being in the galaxy had heard in its true form. A coalition of aggressor empires of Vral hegemony had spent generations trying to conquer or exterminate a young, stubborn species from a world called Earth. Humanity had fought back with a ferocity and inventiveness that had, over decades of grinding war, broken the hegemony's back entirely. Not through superior numbers, never that, but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to stop fighting, even when every rational calculation said they should have lost generations earlier. The final battle Vain's crew had been frozen mid-retreat from wasn't a defeat. It was the opening move of the final offensive, a desperate, brilliant gambit that shattered the hegemony's core fleet so completely that the coalition collapsed within a decade of the tenacity's edge vanishing into slip space, and in the vacuum left behind the surviving minor powers, including the ancestors of the Thrill and Ashkarin, had rebuilt galactic order on the ashes of the war humanity won for them. Then they'd buried humanity's role entirely. Why, Vain said, when Myra laid it out for him in the flickering light of Oracle 7's archive chamber, his voice dangerously quiet, would anyone erase the people who saved them? Oracle 7 answered before Myra could. Because a species capable of breaking an empire like the hegemony is not a comfortable ally to owe a debt. It is a far more comfortable myth. The truth settled into place with sickening clarity. Earth hadn't been destroyed by enemies. As far as any record showed, Earth had survived the war, battered but standing. What happened after was worse than destruction. Humanity had been quietly, deliberately isolated. Trade routes rooted around Sol's system. Diplomatic contact allowed to lapse. Records edited, redacted, retold until humanity became a cautionary bedtime story instead of a species with a home world, a government, and a claim to be heard. Left alone, left forgotten, left perhaps deliberately to fend for itself in the dark, because a galaxy full of powers who owed their peace to humanity's sacrifice found it far easier to build a new order without the debt. Collector still standing at the table. Vain sat with that for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, there was no fury in his voice, only something colder and far more dangerous. They didn't defeat us, he said. They just made sure we'd never come home to collect. Myra felt the weight of what she'd uncovered settle over her like a physical thing. If this gets out, it has to get out. Vain stood. And for the first time since waking, something of the war he'd been frozen mid-fight and returned to his eyes. 50,000 years of lies built this peace. I want to know what it's actually worth. Outside the archive chamber, unnoticed by either of them, a diplomatic aide who served two masters, The conquered council and a much older, much colder power that had never truly died slipped away to send an encrypted message. The humans know. Move before they can prove it. The attack came at 300-way station time, 3 days after Myra's discovery. In the dead, quiet hour when the conquered defenses ran on skeleton crews and good intentions, Vain felt it before the alarms did as soldier's instinct, honed across a war 50,000 years cold, but never truly extinguished. He was awake, dressed, and moving toward the Tenacity's edge berth before the first klaxon sounded. Ships inbound, Oracle 7 reported, voice tight with something almost like alarm. Unregistered configuration matches no current conquered signature. A pause, and when the AI spoke again, its voice had gone very still. Configuration partially matches archived Vraxel Hegemony Warcraft, modified, updated, but unmistakable. They're not extinct, Vain said grimly, strapping into the captain's chair he hadn't sat in for 50,000 years. Just patient. The remnant of the old hegemony, a shadow faction that had survived its empire's collapse by going quiet, rebuilding in the dark corners of conquered space for 500 centuries, waiting for a moment just like this one. Struck the way station with brutal precision, aiming not to conquer, but to erase. Erase the ship, erase the crew, erase the proof before it could ever reach a wider audience and unravel the comfortable order built on its absence. Conquered defense forces unprepared and outmatched by an enemy their tacticians had only ever studied as ancient history began to fall back. Vain didn't. Oracle, he said, hands moving across a console, 50,000 years old and still impossibly faster than anything the modern galaxy had built. Tell me you kept your teeth. Weapon systems restored to 83% capacity, Oracle 7 replied. And there was something in its tone that might in a human voice have been called relish. Shall I remind the galaxy why they were so eager to forget us? Do it. The Tenacity's edge woke fully for the first time in 50,000 years. Not as a relic, not as a wreck, but as exactly what it had always been. A warship built by a species that had learned through generations of desperate war exactly how to survive the unsurvivable. Asa, watching from the Ashkaran flagship's bridge as conquered defenses crumbled around the station, saw the ancient vessel's weapons, systems flare to life, and felt something between terror and awe. Asa's voice crackled over Cum's tense and controlled. What in the void is that ship doing? Asa watched the Tenacity's edge pivot with impossible precision, its ancient targeting systems locking onto hegemony remnant ships that modern sensors had barely begun to track. I think, she said slowly, it's reminding us why they were the ones the story warned us about. Myra, strapped into an observation seat beside Vain, watched the tactical display fill with converging fire and felt the full weight of the moment settle over her, the culmination of 50,000 years of silence breaking open in real time. Captain, she said quietly, this is it, isn't it? The line? Vain didn't look away from the display. His voice, when it came, was steady in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. We already drew it once, he said. 50,000 years ago. Let's remind them what happens to people who cross it. What followed would be studied, replayed, and argued over in every conquered military academy for generations to come. But in the moment, it was simply this: 22 humans, one ancient AI, and a single 4K warship against a hegemony remnant fleet 3 times their size. And it wasn't close. The Tenacity's edge moved like nothing the modern galaxy had ever built to move. Oracle 7's tactical systems honed across generations of grinding, desperate war against an enemy that had once nearly wiped out an entire species, tore through targeting solutions that conquered peacetime-honed defense computers couldn't even model in real time. Vain called maneuvers that should have been impossible for a ship that size. And the ship answered, every system built with the singular brutal purpose of ensuring humanity would never again be caught unable to fight back. Redirect auxiliary power to forward batteries. Vain snapped, and Ori, the master sergeant who'd cleared a mess hall stripping a rifle 3 weeks earlier, was already moving, hands finding controls 50,000 years, obsolete with the ease of muscle memory that no amount of time could erase. Captain, the young engineer Priya Anand called from a secondary station, voice tight but steady. Hegemony ships are converging on our starboard flank. They're trying to box us in. Let them, Vain said, and there was something almost like grim satisfaction in his voice. Oracle, execute Ember Pattern. Ember Pattern has not been executed in 50,000 years, Oracle 7 said, and if an AI could sound nostalgic, it did. Executing. The Tenacity's edge spun through the converging hegemony formation in a maneuver that should have torn the ship apart. Weapons firing in a sequence too fast and too precise for modern sensors to fully track. And when the smoke cleared, 6 enemy ships were dead or crippled, and the rest were breaking formation in open, undisguised panic. Asa watched it happen from the Ashgren flagship, and beside her, THM had gone very quiet. They're not fighting like survivors, Asa murmured. They're fighting like people who never stopped being at war. Then let's make sure they know, TH said, and gave the order that would matter more than any single shot fired that night. All conquered forces redirect fire support the Tenacity's edge. Whatever debt this galaxy owes them, she paused, watching the ancient warship carve a path through an enemy fleet built to erase it. We start paying it tonight. It was not humanity's fight alone anymore. Conquered ships that had hesitated, uncertain whether to treat the ancient vessel as ally or threat, made their choice in the heat of battle, turning their fire alongside the Tenacity's edge instead of away from it. A hegemony remnant broke within the hour. Their command ship, recognizing the battle was lost, attempted a slip space retreat and found, to its evident horror, that Oracle 7 had anticipated exactly that. No, Vain said quietly, watching the enemy flagship's escape vector collapse under a targeting solution. 50,000 years in the making. Not this time. Nobody vanishes on my watch again. When the last hegemony ship went dark, the silence on the Tenacity's edge bridge was different from any silence Vain had known in 50,000 years of waking. It wasn't grief. It wasn't the aftermath of a desperate, uncertain retreat. It was for the first time since he'd opened his eyes in a frozen pod and asked an unanswerable question, something close to victory. In the days that followed, the truth Myra had unearthed could no longer be buried. Not with half the conquered assembled fleet having watched a single ancient human warship break a hegemony remnant fleet that shouldn't have existed. fighting to erase evidence of a lie 50,000 years old. The conquered council convened an emergency session. Redacted archives were reopened, cross-referenced against Oracle 7's restored memory cores and the story that emerged. Humanity's true role in ending the war that shaped the modern galaxy, and the deliberate, quiet erasure that followed spread through conquered space faster than any government could contain. There were factions who wanted to apologize, factions who wanted to deny it further, factions quieter and more numerous than anyone liked to admit, who simply wanted to know, what does humanity want now that it knows the truth? Vain stood before the assembled council. Thrill, Ashgren, and a dozen smaller powers, all watching a man who represented a species they'd spent 50,000 years pretending didn't exist, and gave an answer that would be quoted in conquered history texts for generations after. "We didn't come back for an apology," he said. "We came back because we never stopped being a species with a home. We'd like to know if it's still there." That was the moment Oracle 7 had been waiting for. "Captain," the AI said, and something in its voice made every head on the bridge turn. "During the battle, I recovered a data fragment from the hegemony remnants command cores. Coordinates encrypted, but consistent with Sol System's last known galactic position. Coordinates that should not have existed in any modern database, unless someone has been tracking Earth's location for a very long time and hiding it." The chamber went utterly silent. "Are you telling me," Vain said slowly, "that Earth's location was never actually lost?" "I am telling you," Oracle 7 said, "that someone somewhere has known exactly where humanity's home world sits for 50,000 years and chose never to say." It was Throke the Silence, her voice heavy with the particular shame of someone realizing their own government's fingerprints were somewhere on the crime. Then it's past time that changed. The Council's vote to release the coordinates was neither unanimous nor easy old fears about what humanity, restored to strength and armed with 50,000 years of grievance, might do to a galaxy that had wronged it ran deep. But Vain's crew had already shown the galaxy something more compelling than any political argument, restraint. They'd fought only when attacked, protected, conquered lives alongside their own, and asked for nothing but the truth. It was enough. On the bridge of the Tenacity's edge, 3 weeks after waking from 50,000 years of frozen sleep, Captain Elias Vain watched Sol Systems coordinates populate the navigation display, and for a long moment he simply looked at them, unable to speak. Myra stood beside him, the last living thread connecting a lost lineage to the crew, who'd carried humanity's memory across 500 centuries. "Ready, Captain?" she asked quietly. Vain thought of every soldier who died believing humanity's sacrifice would be remembered. Every year the galaxy spent pretending it hadn't happened. Every quiet act of erasure that had almost succeeded. "Set the course," he said, and his voice for the first time since waking carried something unmistakably like hope. "Let's go home." The Tenacity's edge turned toward Sol, ancient engines burning bright against the dark, carrying humanity's return not as an act of vengeance, but as something far more powerful. A debt finally acknowledged, a silence finally broken, and a species that after 50,000 years had finally been allowed to stop being a ghost story and become once more simply home, and simply home, and